The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like silence, and that was worse. I was standing on the command deck of my station when the reports stopped coming in from 3 of our outposts at once. Not damaged, not delayed. Stopped, clean and total, as if someone had reached into the signal itself and turned it off. My name is Kale Vantis. For 300 years I served the Thren Compact as an overseer, one of the ancient caretakers of a peace that spanned 9 star systems. We called ourselves the Ascended. We had stopped fighting each other so long ago that war had become a word in old textbooks, something other species did before they learned better. We watched over lesser civilizations the way a gardener watches over a field, deciding what grew and what was quietly removed. I did not know yet that the silence from those outposts was the sound of that garden ending. Let me take you back before I tell you how it ended, because you need to understand what we believed we were. The compact was built by 9 species long before my grandmother's grandmother was born. We had cured our own diseases, ended our own hunger, and stopped our own wars by carefully shaping what our people were allowed to become. Any Thren child who showed signs of aggression beyond what was useful was gently corrected before adulthood. Any thought that threatened harmony was reshaped, kindly, in quiet rooms with soft light. We told ourselves this was mercy. We told ourselves this was wisdom. We extended this same care to every species we found. When we discovered a world with intelligent life, we did not conquer it with weapons. We conquered it with patience. We would arrive in ships too large and too silent to be mistaken for anything except power itself, and we would offer guidance. Most species accepted. Their leaders were flattered. Their people were amazed. Within a generation, their wars ended, their diseases faded, and their skies filled with our vessels, drifting like slow-moving moons. We called this elevation. I administered elevation on 4 worlds myself. I remember standing on a balcony overlooking a city of a species called the Orin, watching their children run beneath our ships without fear, and feeling something I can only describe as holy. They looked up at us the way old human stories describe looking up at gods. I did not correct that comparison. None of us ever did. Humanity was different from the start, and I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only thing I have left worth offering you. When we first found their world, 60 years before the day I am describing, we sent the standard approach. Ships arrived, broadcasts played, guidance was offered. They opened fire, not with weapons capable of hurting us, not in that first encounter, but with everything they had, aimed at ships large enough to blot out their moon. Our observers found this fascinating rather than alarming. A species so young, reacting with fear instead of wonder, we adjusted our approach. We pulled back. We built what we called a soft blockade, a quiet net of monitoring stations along the edge of their space, and we waited for them to calm down and see reason, the way every other species eventually had. They never did. For 60 years, humanity sat behind that blockade like a held breath. We told each other they were building nothing, achieving nothing, trapped by our patience into permanent smallness. Some of us pitied them. I confess that I did too. I imagined them as a species frozen in place, banging on a door that would never open, growing bitter and small in the dark. I was wrong about almost everything, and the day I began to learn that started with a woman in a detention chamber 3 levels below my office. Her name was Grace Whitfield, and she had been our guest, if you can call it that, for 11 years. She had been part of a human diplomatic vessel that strayed too close to the blockade line, and rather than destroy it, we had captured it, believing a live human specimen would help us understand how to finally guide her species toward acceptance. 11 years of study had taught us her language, her biology, and almost nothing about her mind, because she had never once given us what we wanted, which was fear. I visited her that day only because protocol required a routine oversight check before I departed for the border assignment I had been given. I expected the visit to take minutes. It took much longer, because for the first time in 11 years, I actually listened to what she said, instead of simply recording it. She was sitting on the floor of her chamber, instead of the provided furniture, which she had told the guards many times she found insulting in its softness. When I entered, she looked up at me with an expression I did not have a name for yet. I would learn later that humans call it pity. I asked her, as I had asked her 100 times before, why her species refused guidance that had brought peace to every world we touched. She asked me a question instead of answering mine, which was very like her. She asked if I had ever seen what elevation looked like for a species that said no. I told her that no species had ever said no for long. Correction was always eventually accepted, because correction was always kind. She laughed, and it was not a happy sound. She told me that kindness measured only by the one giving it is not kindness at all. She said something I did not understand until much later, something like, "You built your gods on lies you never had to test, and one day someone is going to test them, and you will not survive being asked to prove what you have only ever performed." I dismissed this as the bitterness of a captive. I had heard captives say angry things before. I left her chamber and boarded my transport toward the border, carrying her words the way you carry a stone in your shoe, small and annoying and easy to ignore until it isn't. The border assignment itself was meant to be nothing important. I had been sent, somewhat as a quiet demotion after a disagreement with a senior overseer, to oversee what was called containment reinforcement near the edge of human space. It was a role for someone being politely sidelined. I understood the message. I accepted it with the calm we were all trained to project, even when something inside us wished to protest. The outposts along that border were small, quiet places, staffed by junior officers who spent their days watching sensors that almost never showed anything worth noting. Humanity, as far as we knew, had no ships capable of reaching us, and even if they had, our shields and our fleet doctrine had gone untested for so long that we simply assumed they remained undefeatable, the way you assume the sun will rise. I arrived at the central border station 3 days before the silence began, and I want you to understand how ordinary those 3 days felt, because that ordinariness is part of what makes what came after so hard to describe. I toured the station with its commander, a steady officer named Celis Doran, who walked me through sensor arrays and shield generators with the practiced pride of someone showing off a garden he had tended for years. He told me the blockade had held for 60 years without a single serious incident. He told me humanity had grown quiet in recent years, their transmissions less frequent, their border patrols less visible. He suggested, and I remember agreeing, that this quiet meant they had finally accepted their situation. I look back now and wonder how many other quiet things we mistook for acceptance, when they were actually the sound of someone finishing their preparations. On the second day, a deep scout station near the very edge of the blockade line stopped transmitting. Command labeled it a malfunction, the kind of thing that happened occasionally when equipment aged past its expected service life. I remember feeling a small discomfort at this explanation, a feeling I could not justify with evidence, only with instinct. I said nothing, because overseers were not meant to speak on instinct. We spoke on data, and the data said malfunction. On the third day, 2 more stations went silent, and this time even command could not pretend it was equipment failure, because the stations were of different ages, different designs, and different distances from each other. Something had touched all 3, and touched them so cleanly that not one alarm had been triggered before the silence fell. I stood beside Commander Doran as we reviewed the last fragments of data from those stations. There was no combat signature, no debris, no distress call, just data streams that simply stopped mid-transmission, as though someone had walked up and closed a door without knocking first. I thought of Grace Whitfield, sitting on the floor of her chamber, telling me that no one had ever tested our gods before. I did not say her name aloud. I only felt, for the first time in 300 years of calm and certain living, something that I now recognize as fear, arriving quietly, the way real fear always does, not as a scream, but as a question you cannot answer. That night, alone in my quarters aboard the station, I opened a private channel and requested the full sensor logs from every border post for the last month. I told myself I was simply being thorough, the way a good overseer should be. I did not admit to myself that I was searching for a pattern, because admitting that would have meant admitting I already suspected there was one. I found nothing conclusive in those logs. No enemy signatures, no unusual energy readings, nothing that our systems recognized as a threat. Whatever had reached those stations had done so in a way our detection had never been designed to notice, which was, in itself, the most alarming discovery of all. I remember closing that file and sitting in the low light of my quarters for a long while, listening to the quiet hum of the station around me, and thinking about how easily 300 years of certainty can start to feel thin when you are the one holding it. The next morning, a single contact appeared on the long-range sensors, crossing the blockade line without hesitation, without escort, and without a single transmission of greeting or warning. Commander Doran laughed when the report came in. One ship, he said, alone, uncoordinated, almost careless in its approach. He called it confirmation that humanity remained as disorganized as we had always believed. I did not laugh. I watched the contact's trajectory on the display, and something about its steadiness unsettled me more than chaos would have. It did not move like a ship testing our defenses or hoping to slip past unnoticed. It moved like a ship that already knew exactly where it was going and exactly what it intended to do when it arrived. Our systems identified it eventually, translating fragments of an old human naming convention into something our archives could catalog. It came back labeled as a battlecruiser, a class of vessel our own analysts considered outdated by our standards, built for an era before humanity had even fully understood what our fleets were capable of. I remember Commander Doran ordering our own ships into a standard intercept formation, calm and almost bored, the way you might swat away an insect you assume cannot sting. I remember requesting, quietly, that our shields be raised to full readiness ahead of schedule, a request that drew a raised look from him but no argument. I remember standing at the viewport of that station, watching a single point of light grow steadily closer against the dark, and feeling, for the first time in my very long life, that I did not know what was about to happen. Grace Whitfield's words returned to me then, uninvited, the way true things often do. You built your gods on lies you never had to test. I did not yet know that within the hour, those lies would be tested completely, and that nothing about the way we saw ourselves, or the way the rest of the galaxy saw us, would survive what that single ship was about to do. The ship did not slow down as it crossed into range, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about what kind of encounter this was going to be. Commander Doran ordered a standard hailing sequence, the same greeting we had used on every species we had ever guided toward peace. It was a calm voice, translated into every known human dialect, offering the vessel a chance to identify itself and stand down before our defensive formation closed the distance. I remember the confidence in his tone, as if he were welcoming a lost child home rather than addressing a warship that had just crossed a border 60 years in the making. There was no response. Our sensors continued tracking the vessel as it advanced, and I studied its profile on the display, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with everything our archives told us about human engineering. It was not sleek, not elegant, not built with the smooth curves our own ships favored. It was blunt and heavy, its hull scarred in places that had clearly been repaired rather than replaced, as though this ship had been in real conflict before and had simply been patched up to fight again. Our own vessels, by contrast, had never needed repair because they had never truly been tested. I asked Commander Doran what the ship's designation meant, since our systems had translated only a partial name from old human naming records. He told me it did not matter, that a single ship posed no threat to a full defensive formation backed by 3 orbital platforms, and that our shields alone could absorb anything a vessel that size could produce. I wanted to believe him. Every instinct trained into me over 300 years told me to believe him, but I found myself thinking again of Grace Whitfield's calm, unshaken voice and the particular way she had looked at me, as though she already knew something I had not yet been forced to learn. The order came to intercept. 6 of our vessels moved into formation around the approaching ship, spreading into the layered pattern that had served the compact for 10,000 years, a formation designed to allow no attacker a clean line of approach and no defender an unnecessary risk. I watched the tactical display as our ships closed the distance, their shield strength registering at full capacity, their weapon systems charged and ready, every measure of readiness reading exactly as it should. The human vessel did not alter its course. It did not attempt evasive maneuvers. It did not power down as if preparing to surrender, and it did not accelerate as if preparing to run. It simply continued forward, steady and unbothered, the way something moves when it has already decided the outcome before the encounter begins. I remember the moment weapons fire began, because it did not begin the way I expected. Our lead vessel opened with a precision strike meant to disable rather than destroy, a courtesy we extended even to hostile ships, because destruction was considered wasteful and uncivilized among the ascended. The strike found its mark exactly as calculated, striking the human vessel's forward section with enough force to cripple most ships we had ever encountered. The human ship shuddered, sparks of energy scattered across its hull in the visual feed, and then it kept coming. I watched Commander Doran's expression shift for the first time, from confidence to confusion. He ordered a second strike, more focused, targeting what our scans identified as a critical power junction near the vessel's midsection. The strike landed true. The ship's outer plating buckled visibly, venting atmosphere into the vacuum in a bright, violent plume that any of our own vessels would have registered as catastrophic damage. The human ship altered its heading only slightly, as if adjusting for the wound rather than reacting to it, and continued its approach. I want you to understand what was happening in that command deck, because I do not think words can fully carry it. We were not simply losing a battle. We were watching an assumption die in real time, the assumption that damage of a certain scale meant defeat, the assumption that a wounded ship would retreat or surrender, because ours always had, in every training exercise, in every simulation, in every encounter we had ever studied. This ship did not know it was supposed to stop. Commander Doran gave the order for a full coordinated strike from all 6 vessels at once, a maneuver reserved for the rarest and most severe threats, one that had not been used in genuine combat within living memory. I watched the tactical display light up as 6 ships fired in near-perfect unison, converging their fire on a single point along the human vessel's hull. For a moment, I believed it was over. The impact was immense, a cascade of light and force that should have ended any engagement instantly. Our sensors registered catastrophic structural failure across nearly a third of the human ship's frame. And then, through the wreckage and the venting atmosphere, weapons fire answered back. It was not elegant. It was not precise in the way our own strikes were precise. It struck one of our vessels, the one nearest the human ship's damaged section, and I watched on the display as that vessel's shields we had trusted completely, failed within seconds, rather than the sustained hours our simulations had always predicted. The ship did not simply lose power. It broke apart, visibly, its hull splitting along a seam that should never have been able to fail so quickly, and for the first time in my long life, I watched a Thren vessel die in open combat. I do not think I breathed for several seconds. Commander Doran's voice, when he finally spoke, had lost every trace of the confidence he had carried only minutes before. He ordered the remaining ships to fall back into a defensive perimeter, a maneuver meant to protect the border station itself, and I understood in that moment that we had already stopped thinking about winning. We were only thinking about surviving. The human vessel did not pursue our retreating ships. Instead, it turned, slowly and deliberately, toward the border station itself, and I felt every certainty I had ever held about our place in the galaxy begin to crack beneath that single, patient movement. I asked Commander Doran what our shields could withstand from a vessel of this class. He told me, his voice tight, that our shields had never been tested against sustained fire of this intensity, because no vessel in living memory had ever produced fire of this intensity. I understood then that we were not facing an aggressor testing our limits. We were facing the limits themselves, arriving all at once, after 60 years of pretending they did not exist. The human ship opened fire on the station's outer shield array, and I watched the readings drop faster than any simulation had ever predicted, faster than any of our engineers would have believed possible even an hour earlier. Sparks lit up along the interior corridors as secondary systems failed, and I heard, for the first time in my career, the sound of alarms that meant something real rather than routine. Commander Doran ordered an evacuation of non-essential personnel to the station's inner core, a protocol none of us had ever expected to use outside of training exercises. I remember the strange calm that settled over me in that moment, not because I was not afraid, but because fear, when it becomes large enough, sometimes stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like clarity. I moved toward the communication array instead of the evacuation route, because I needed to understand what was happening, not simply survive it. I opened every channel our systems could reach, hoping to catch some fragment of transmission from the human vessel, some explanation, some demand, anything that might tell us why a single ship had crossed 60 years of silence to do this. For a long while, there was nothing but static and the distant tremor of impacts against the station's hull. Then, faintly, a voice came through, calm in a way that unsettled me more than anger would have. It was not gloating, it was not triumphant. It sounded tired, and it sounded certain, the voice of someone who had made a decision long before this day and was simply seeing it through. I could not make out the words clearly through the interference, only fragments, something about graves, something about elevation, something about a debt long overdue. The station shuddered violently as another strike landed, and I was thrown against a support column hard enough to lose my footing entirely. When I regained my balance, half the command deck's lighting had failed, replaced by the harsh red glow of emergency systems, and Commander Doran was shouting orders that no longer carried the calm authority he had walked in with only an hour before. I looked at the tactical display one last time before the primary systems failed completely, and what I saw has stayed with me every day since. The human vessel, damaged, venting atmosphere from a dozen wounds that should have ended it 3 times over, continued forward, steady and unbroken, toward the heart of a station we had believed untouchable. I understood, in that moment, that we were not simply losing a fight. We were watching the death of everything we had told ourselves we were. The station's core held longer than the outer shields had, but not by much, and I spent those final minutes not hiding, but watching, because some part of me refused to look away from the thing that was unmaking everything I believed. Commander Doran gathered the remaining officers near the secondary command console, the last functioning station on the deck, and tried to organize a coherent response. I remember how strange it looked, seasoned officers who had spent their entire careers managing calm, orderly systems, suddenly fumbling with manual overrides they had only ever practiced in simulations that assumed a gentler kind of failure. I asked him directly what our doctrine offered for a situation like this, since every strategy I had studied in 300 years of service assumed an opponent who would eventually yield to overwhelming, layered force. He did not answer me immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, and he admitted that our doctrine had never truly prepared for an opponent who simply refused to stop. That admission frightened me more than the attack itself. I want to explain something about how the Compact fought, because I think it explains everything about how we lost. Our wars, the few we still remembered from ancient history, had always ended through exhaustion of will rather than exhaustion of resources. An opposing fleet would take enough damage to recognize the futility of continuing, and would withdraw, and both sides would return to their calculations, satisfied that a lesson had been delivered without unnecessary loss. We built our entire military philosophy around the assumption that everyone shared this same threshold, this same point where continuing became irrational. Humanity, it seemed, measured that threshold differently, or perhaps did not believe in one at all. The human vessel's next strike came directly at the station's primary shield generator, a system so deeply protected that no simulation in our records had ever modeled its destruction. I remember the tremor that ran through the entire structure as the strike connected, followed by a silence more terrifying than any alarm, because it meant the systems monitoring that silence had themselves gone dark. Commander Doran ordered what remained of our defensive vessels to regroup for a final coordinated strike, a decision I now understand was born of desperation rather than strategy. I watched as 3 battered ships, all that remained of our original formation, moved into position, their shields flickering unevenly, their weapon systems drawing power reserves clearly never meant to be pushed this far. I remember thinking, in that moment, of every world I had ever helped elevate, every species that had looked up at ships like these with wonder rather than suspicion. I wondered, with a clarity that frightened me, whether any of them had ever seen what I was seeing now, a Thren formation reduced to improvisation and fear. The 3 ships fired together, and for a moment, the display lit up with the kind of light that made the whole command deck flinch. When the light faded, the human vessel remained, damaged further, trailing debris and atmosphere from wounds across nearly half its visible hull, but still moving, still firing, still advancing toward the station with the same unbroken steadiness it had carried since it first crossed the blockade line. One of our 3 remaining ships lost power entirely in the exchange, drifting silently out of formation, its crew's fate unknown to us in that moment and, I confess, unknown to me still. The second ship attempted to retreat, breaking formation in a way that would have been unthinkable only hours earlier, when retreat was a concept reserved for training exercises rather than genuine necessity. The third continued firing until a final strike from the human vessel silenced it completely, its hull venting a bright plume of atmosphere before its systems failed and its momentum carried it, dark and lifeless, past the edge of the station's viewport. I watched all of this happen through a viewport rather than a display, because by then the tactical systems had failed, along with almost everything else, and I found myself simply standing there, watching the death of ships I had known by name, feeling something I did not yet have words for. Commander Doran made the decision, in those final moments before the human vessel reached firing range of the station itself, to broadcast a full surrender, a decision that would have been unthinkable to him only hours before, and one that I do not believe any overseer in the history of the Compact had ever been forced to authorize. The broadcast went out on every channel we had, plain and unadorned, offering full compliance in exchange for the safety of those still aboard the station. I remember the silence that followed it, stretching long enough that I began to believe it had gone unheard, or worse, unheeded. Then the attack stopped. I do not think I can adequately describe the strangeness of that silence, after the violence that had preceded it. The station groaned and settled around us, emergency systems humming faintly in the dark, and beyond the viewport, the human vessel simply held its position, damaged and patient, no longer firing but clearly not departing either. A transmission came through moments later, and this time it was clear enough to understand fully. It was the same voice I had caught fragments of earlier, a woman's voice, steady despite obvious exhaustion, carrying none of the triumph I might have expected from a victor. She identified herself as Commander Nora Ashcombe, of the vessel that had just, in the space of little more than an hour, dismantled a formation we had believed unbeatable. She did not ask for our surrender terms, because she said we had nothing left worth taking. She asked instead whether we understood why she had come. Commander Doran, to his credit, answered honestly, admitting that he did not. What she told him, and what I heard standing beside him in that darkened command deck, changed everything I understood about the last 60 years of quiet along that blockade line, and everything I understood about what humanity had been doing while we assumed they were simply enduring. She said that for decades, human vessels had quietly recovered fragments of information from the edges of compact space, records left behind by refugees, by defectors, by the rare wildling ship that managed to slip past our patrols with something worth telling. She said these fragments had slowly assembled into a picture none of us had ever intended anyone outside the compact to see, a picture of what elevation truly meant for species that resisted it, of populations quietly reduced under the guise of correction, of entire cultures reshaped into compliance, not through guidance, but through the patient, invisible violence of control. She said humanity had spent 60 years not sitting idle behind our blockade, as we had so comfortably assumed, but preparing, studying, and building something capable of finally testing what we had never allowed anyone to test before. I remember Commander Doran's voice shaking as he asked her what she intended to do with that knowledge now that the battle was over. She told him this was never meant to be a conquest. It was a message, delivered the only way she believed we would ever actually listen. She said humanity had no interest in replacing us as rulers of this stretch of the galaxy. They had only wanted, finally, to prove that our godhood was a performance, sustained only because no one had ever been willing or able to test it honestly. I stood there, listening to those words settle over the darkened command deck, and I felt something shift inside me that I do not think can ever shift back. For 300 years I had believed, without ever truly questioning it, that our peace was real, that our guidance was kindness, that the calm we had built across 9 systems was something worth defending exactly as it was. Grace Whitfield's voice returned to me again, clearer now than it had ever been in her chamber. You built your gods on lies you never had to test. I understood, standing in the wreckage of that station, that the testing had finally happened, and that our godhood had not survived it. The station's emergency systems kept enough air and light running for us to survive the hours that followed, but survival, I learned quickly, is not the same as recovery, and the difference between the two became the true subject of everything that happened next. Commander Doran ordered a full accounting of losses once communication with the wider compact network was restored, a task that fell to me since I was, technically, still the senior overseer present, despite my supposed demotion to this quiet border post. I remember sitting at a half-functioning terminal, compiling names and ranks of officers who would not be returning to their families, and feeling the weight of each one settle differently than the last, because I had never before compiled a list like this that was not simply theoretical. 2 of our vessels were confirmed lost entirely, their crews unaccounted for in a way our systems had never been designed to properly track, because loss on this scale had simply never happened to us before. The 3rd vessel that had attempted retreat was found adrift at the edge of the system, its crew alive but its systems damaged beyond immediate repair, and I remember the strange relief I felt at that single piece of good news, disproportionate to its size, simply because it was the only good news available. Commander Doran took the losses harder than I expected, though I suppose I should not have been surprised. He had commanded this station for over a decade, had trained many of the officers we lost personally, and had built his entire sense of purpose around the belief that his post was a quiet, honorable place where nothing truly dangerous would ever happen. I found him alone in a side corridor several hours after the human vessel finally withdrew, sitting with his back against a wall that still bore scorch marks from the battle, and I did not have the words to comfort him, because I was still searching for words to comfort myself. He asked me, quietly, whether I thought we deserved what had happened. I did not answer him honestly in that moment, because I was not yet ready to answer myself honestly, and I regret that hesitation more than almost anything else from that day. In the days that followed, as reports of the engagement spread through compact channels faster than any of us could control, I began to understand the true scale of what had happened, and it was far larger than a single lost formation at a single border station. Word of Commander Ashcomb's message spread with a speed that stunned every senior official I spoke to. Within a week, wildling species we had guided for centuries, species that had never once questioned our authority in living memory, began asking questions through official channels that no overseer had ever been prepared to answer honestly. They asked about elevation programs on worlds whose populations had mysteriously declined during the transition. They asked about records that had gone missing, about species that had simply stopped appearing in compact reports after a certain point, about whether the peace we had given them had cost more than we had ever admitted. I was summoned back from the border station to answer for my role in the engagement, and I remember the journey back feeling less like a return home and more like walking toward a reckoning I had somehow always known was coming, even if I had never let myself believe it. During that journey, I requested access to records I had never thought to question before, records concerning the very elevation programs Commander Ashcombe had referenced. I want to be honest about what I found, because honesty is the only currency I have left that means anything. I found population records for a species called the Varan, a quiet agricultural people we had elevated nearly 2 centuries earlier, records that showed a population decline of nearly a third within the first decade after elevation began, a decline attributed in official compact documents to what was called necessary correction of unstable genetic tendencies. I found similar records for 3 other species, each decline explained away with language so careful and so clinical that it had never once, in 2 centuries, prompted a single question from anyone within our own ranks. I sat with those records for a long while, and I thought about the balcony where I had once stood watching Oran children run beneath our ships without fear, and I wondered, for the first time, what had truly happened to that world in the years after my own visit there. I did not sleep well during that journey, and I do not think I have slept fully well since. When I arrived at the Central Compact Assembly, I found an atmosphere unlike anything I had experienced in 300 years of service. Senior overseers who had once carried themselves with unshakable calm now spoke in hurried, uncertain tones. Junior officials whispered in corridors about whether the compact itself could survive what was being called, in increasingly common usage, the reckoning. I was called to testify before a tribunal convened to investigate both the border engagement and the broader allegations Commander Ashcomb's message had set loose across 9 systems. I want to describe what happened in that tribunal honestly, because I believe it is the only meaningful thing I did in the aftermath of everything that came before. Several senior overseers who testified before me offered careful, practiced denials, framing the population declines as unfortunate but necessary sacrifices in service of long-term stability, framing our entire elevation program as fundamentally benevolent despite its costs. I listened to them speak with the same calm certainty I had once carried myself, and I recognized, with a discomfort I could not shake, how easily that certainty could be performed, even by those who must have known, somewhere beneath it, that it no longer held. When my turn came, I found I could not perform that same certainty any longer. I told the tribunal about the Varan population records and about the 3 other species whose declines I had found buried in language designed never to be questioned. I told them about Grace Whitfield and about the conversation I had dismissed as bitterness only days before everything changed. I told them, plainly, that I believed our elevation programs had never been the mercy we told ourselves they were, and that Commander Ashcomb's message, however painful to hear, was not wrong. I do not think I have ever felt more afraid than I did in that moment, testifying against 300 years of everything I had been raised to believe, in front of officials who held considerable power over what remained of my career and my standing. But I also do not think I have ever felt more certain that I was finally telling the truth. The tribunal did not reach a full resolution that day, and I do not think a single testimony, even an honest one, could undo 2 centuries of carefully maintained lies in a single afternoon. But something shifted in that room, a crack running through the calm certainty that had sustained the compact for so long, and I believe that crack has continued to widen in every day since. I received word, some weeks later, of a private communication requesting my presence at a neutral meeting point along the edge of compact space, a request that came, to my genuine surprise, from Commander Ashcombe herself. I traveled there uncertain of what to expect, half believing it might be some kind of trap, half hoping, in a way I did not fully understand yet, that it might be something else entirely. She met me aboard a small transport vessel, far less imposing than the Battlecruiser that had shattered our formation weeks earlier, and I remember being struck by how ordinary she looked in person, tired, in the particular way of someone who has carried a heavy decision for a long time and is only beginning to set part of it down. She told me she had requested this meeting not to gloat, and not to negotiate any kind of surrender, but because she had heard about my testimony before the tribunal, and she wanted to understand whether it represented something real, or simply another performance meant to protect what remained of the compact's image. I told her, as honestly as I could, that I did not yet know what remained of me to protect, because everything I had believed myself to be for 300 years had been built on a foundation I now understood to be false. She was quiet for a long moment after that, studying me with an expression I still find difficult to fully describe, somewhere between caution and something gentler than I expected from someone who had just ended so many of my people's lives. She told me that humanity had not come to replace us, and had never intended to rule over the species we had once ruled over ourselves. She said the goal had only ever been to force a reckoning that the compact would never have reached on its own, because a species that measures its own peace by the silence of those beneath it will never think to question that silence unless something forces it to listen. I asked her, because I needed to know, whether she believed the cost of that reckoning, the ships and the lives lost in that single engagement, had been worth it. She told me she carried that question with her every day since the battle, and that she did not believe there was an answer that made the weight of it disappear. She said she had lost people too, officers who did not survive the engagement despite humanity's ultimate victory, and that she did not consider what happened a triumph so much as a debt finally paid, at a cost neither side would ever fully recover from. I understood, sitting across from her in that quiet transport vessel, that we were not enemies in the way I had expected enemies to feel. We were two people who had both lost something essential in the same encounter, though what we had lost was very different in shape. I told her, before I left that meeting, that I intended to spend whatever remained of my career trying to undo what I could of the harm the compact had caused, even if I did not yet know how much of that harm could ever truly be undone. She told me that was the only kind of reckoning that had ever mattered to her, not vengeance, not conquest, but the simple, difficult work of finally seeing clearly. I left that meeting understanding something I had never allowed myself to consider before. Our godhood had never been real. It had only ever been a performance, sustained by an audience too afraid, too small, or too controlled to ever question it. Humanity had simply refused to remain that audience, and in refusing, had shown all of us, ourselves included, exactly what we had truly been all along. The months that followed the meeting aboard that quiet transport vessel taught me more about the true shape of the compact than 300 years of service ever had, and I want to walk you through what I witnessed, because I believe the unraveling of a lie is sometimes as important to understand as the lie itself. News of the border engagement had already spread faster than any official channel could contain, but the tribunal's partial findings, once they became public, spread faster still. I remember standing in a public assembly hall on one of the compact's oldest core worlds, watching broadcasts arrive from species we had elevated generations ago, species whose leaders had once thanked us with genuine tears in their eyes for the peace we claimed to have given them. Those same leaders now stood before their own people, asking questions that had clearly been building in silence for a very long time. I watched a broadcast from the Orin homeworld, the very world where I had once stood on a balcony feeling something like holiness, and I saw crowds gathering in public squares, demanding access to population records the compact had always kept sealed under the justification of protecting cultural stability. I confess I watched much of this from a distance, partly out of duty, and partly, I think, because I was afraid of what I would feel if I allowed myself to watch too closely. But distance, I learned, is not the same as safety, and eventually the questions being asked on 100 worlds found their way directly to me. I was called before a second tribunal session some months after my first testimony, this one far larger and far more public than the first, broadcast openly to any compact world that wished to view it. I remember the strange sensation of stepping into that chamber and seeing representatives not only from the 9 founding species of the compact, but from wildling worlds as well, seated with a kind of quiet authority none of them had ever been permitted to hold in official proceedings before. A representative from the Varen homeworld spoke before I did, an elder named Solon Tariq Varen, whose voice carried a weight I had never heard from any compact official in all my years of service. He described, plainly and without theatrical grief, what his people's oral histories had quietly preserved about the years following our elevation of his world, histories that contradicted every official record I had grown up trusting completely. He described families who simply stopped appearing in community records, communities that were relocated under the language of stabilization and never fully accounted for again, and a silence among his people that had lasted 2 centuries because they had believed no one within the compact would ever choose to listen. I sat in that chamber and felt the full weight of what my testimony months earlier had only begun to describe. I had spoken of records and numbers. He spoke of grandparents who never returned from what officials had called temporary relocation, of grief passed quietly down through generations because there had never been anyone willing to acknowledge it as grief at all. When my turn came to speak again, I did not simply repeat what I had said before. I offered instead everything I had uncovered in the months since, records I had spent countless hours tracing through archives that had clearly been designed to discourage exactly this kind of search. I described patterns across multiple elevated worlds that matched almost precisely what Solon Tariq Verin had just described from memory, rather than documentation. Patterns of population decline, of relocation, of silence maintained not through active violence in most cases, but through the quiet, patient reshaping of records and language until the truth simply became difficult to find rather than impossible. I told the tribunal that I no longer believed our elevation programs could be defended as benevolent in any meaningful sense, regardless of the intentions those who designed them may have once genuinely held. I told them that intention, however well meant it might have been generations ago, could not excuse what those programs had clearly become over time, nor could it excuse the willingness of every generation since, including my own, to accept comfortable silence over difficult truth. I do not think my testimony alone changed the outcome of that tribunal, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think false modesty is its own kind of lie. What changed the outcome was the accumulated weight of testimony from dozens of witnesses across dozens of worlds, human included, all converging on the same uncomfortable truth from different directions, until denial finally became more difficult to sustain than acknowledgement. The compact, as an institution, did not collapse entirely in the aftermath, though I know some of my former colleagues expected it to. What emerged instead was something slower and, I believe, more meaningful. A gradual restructuring of authority that stripped the founding species of the unilateral control we had held for millennia, replacing it with a council that included representatives from every world we had once called wildling, given real voice for the first time in the compact's long history. I was offered a position within that new council, not as an overseer in the old sense, but as something closer to a witness and an advocate, someone whose role was explicitly to help uncover and address the harm done under the old order rather than to manage and preserve appearances as I had once been trained to do. I accepted that position, though I want to be honest that I did not accept it out of any sense that it could undo what had already happened. I accepted it because it was the only honest work left for someone like me to do. I received one final communication from Commander Ashcombe some months after the second tribunal concluded, a brief message rather than another meeting, but one that I have kept and returned to many times since. She told me she had followed the tribunal's proceedings from a distance, and that while she took no satisfaction in what the engagement had cost either of our peoples, she believed the reckoning it forced had ultimately mattered, not because humanity had proven itself superior in any way, but because it had forced a system built on unquestioned certainty to finally face the cost of that certainty honestly. She wrote that humanity had never wanted to be gods in our place and had no interest in ruling over species we had once ruled over ourselves. She wrote that the only thing worth building, in her view, was a peace that could survive being questioned honestly, rather than one that depended on no one ever daring to ask. I think about that message often, especially now, years removed from the day the silence fell across 3 border outposts and changed everything I believed about myself and the civilization I had served for 300 years. I no longer think of myself as an overseer in the way I once did, watching over lesser species from some elevated height, deciding quietly what they were permitted to become. I think of myself now simply as someone who spent most of his long life mistaking control for kindness, and who was fortunate, in a strange and costly way, to be forced into finally seeing the difference. I do not know if the new council we have built will succeed where the old compact failed. I do not know if trust, once broken as completely as ours was, can ever be fully rebuilt between species who elevated others and species who were elevated. I do not know if humanity, watching from beyond their own borders, will ever fully trust what we are trying to become now, and I am not certain they should. Not yet, not until we have proven through years of honest action what we once only performed through comfortable words. But I know this much, and I offer it to you not as triumph, but as the only honest truth I have left to give. We called ourselves gods for 10,000 years, and no one within our reach was ever permitted to test that claim honestly, until a single wounded battlecruiser crossed a border we believed unbreakable, and shattered every comfortable lie we had built our entire civilization upon. We were never gods. We had simply never met anyone willing to prove it, until the day we finally did.